Welcome, everybody, on this beautiful Thursday evening. Just a few days past the spring solstice, and we're looking to brighter days ahead. And I hope that you've had a great day today. And regardless of how your day has been today, it's about to get better because we are going to have a wonderful conversation tonight. My name is Judith Kelly. I'm the Dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy. Welcome to the Stand For event, which is a series sponsored by the Duke Sanford School of Public Policy, and honoring our founder, Terry Sanford, who urged all his students and people in general, to think about what they stand for, to stand for something. And we have been honoring him through this series by focusing on different things that were important to Terry Sanford: civil rights, equality, education, different issues. And today we're going to be focusing on racial justice and its connection to child well-being. We're very pleased to be able to bring this event to you through the generous support of the Junior Narkinen Charitable Trust. And we're also pleased about our co-sponsors, which tonight is the Duke Center for Child and Family Policy. And also we're working together with the Samuel Dubois Cook Center on Social Equity, as well as the Divinity School. So before I hand it over to the folks who are going to run the event tonight, I want to remind everybody that on April 15th, we're going to have a talk in the Stand For series as well, that is focusing on this arc to justice that we have been launching, a new podcast that's featuring two of our stars, Sandy Darity here from the Sanford School, and the folk artist Kirsten, his wife, who is doing it together with him. And they're just it's a wonderful series, and they're going to be live with us on April 15th for a conversation. So we hope you can join us then. But for now, I want to introduce Leslie Babinski, who directs the Sanford School Center for Child and Family Policy. And she's going to introduce you to the Dean of the Divinity School, who's then going to introduce you to the Reverend Starsky Wilson, whom I would like very much to welcome here tonight. Leslie, over to you.
Thank you, Dean Kelly. I'm so pleased to be here this evening representing the Center for Child and Family Policy, as you mentioned, one of the co-sponsors for tonight's event. I'd also like to thank the Duke Divinity School and the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center for Social Equity for co-sponsoring this event as well. During the event tonight, Reverend Dr. Wilson will speak for about 20 minutes, and that will give us plenty of time for discussion and questions. I'd like to thank Dr. Carolyn Barnes, Assistant Professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy, and Dr. Clinton Boyd Jr., a postdoctoral associate in the Cook Center, for moderating the discussion this evening. Participants, you can submit your questions via the Q&A function at any time, and they'll be queued. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce Professor Gregory Jones, Dean of Duke's Divinity School. Dean Jones was a mentor to Starsky Wilson when he was a student in the Doctor of Ministry program in the Divinity School. Dr. Jones, over to you.
Thank you, Leslie. It's a great joy to greet you all this evening. And it's a great privilege to be able to introduce someone whom I respect greatly and whom I'm also privileged to call a friend. The Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson is the president and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund. He was educated at Xavier University in New Orleans, at Eden Theological Seminary, and now has a Doctor of Ministry degree from Duke Divinity School. I first met Starsky when he came to the D-Min program at Duke and had the privilege of teaching him in a class on strategy. I quickly discovered the importance of his leadership. He has a gift of relational building of skills with people. He is an incredible leader. He knows how to cross sectors, and he's a brilliant strategist. Indeed, even as he was a student in my class, I began to think he could teach the course instead of me. He has the skills that you can see in his background. He's a pastor. He's a philanthropy leader. He's been an activist. He co-chaired the Ferguson Commission in St. Louis. He's been on boards and agencies of various sorts. And yet the very lecture that he's going to bring tonight gives you a sense of that gift of strategy that he's been developing and honing as a pastor, as an educator, as a philanthropist, as an activist, because he sees things at the intersections. If there's anything that the pandemic of the last year, the racial unrest and the economic disruption and the mental health challenges that we've discovered over the past year, is that these are not unrelated issues. That if we want to make progress on race and justice, if we want to make progress on healthcare and economic opportunity and education, we need to see them at the intersections. I learned much from having Starsky Wilson in my class. I've admired the leadership that he has developed in St. Louis and now in Washington, D.C. His leadership as president and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund promises to bring all of his diverse gifts together in an extraordinary way. His talk tonight is entitled, Why Child Well-Being and Racial Equity Go Hand in Hand. Would you join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson?
Thank you so much, Dean Jones. It is indeed a privilege and an honor to be with this community, with the Duke University community. Thank you, Dean Kelly, for the hospitality and invitation to be a part of the Stand For series. I'm grateful to all of the co-sponsors from the Divinity School to the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center to the Center for Child and Family Policy for the work that you're doing and for your great grace toward me with the opportunity to be a part of it. I'm grateful. I come to share on behalf, of course, of the Children's Defense Fund and our work. I'll share a bit about that work in the context of this conversation, but look greatly forward to having the opportunity to share and dialogue with your questions and or concerns. This topic, where we consider the intersection of child well-being and racial equity, is one, quite frankly, that leapt forth at me from the work I did in the doctoral project in the Divinity School just a few years ago. While researching, wrestling with the reality of my own existence, because it was when I was in coursework in the DMIN program that an uprising broke out in Ferguson, Missouri, that the course of my studies, where I was going to focus on collective impact and ways to advance child well-being through collective impact strategies, shifted to my own discernment of leadership as a clergy person who was guiding a congregation and leading a philanthropy at the same time in the midst of a racial reckoning in America in 2014. I know for many 2020 was the year, but in 2014, on August 9th, when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, August 10th, I got on a plane to come to Durham for a face-to-face week-long intensive in the DMIN program. And there is where I began wrestling with the intersection of what it means to care for Black and brown children, because an 18-year-old recent high school graduate lay in the middle of the street for 4.5 hours, and teenagers gathered around his body wondering what they might do. And there in class, removed from the situation for a week of study, I began to reflect and to write and to mourn and to lament and to develop strategy. Because the philanthropy I served worked on child well-being. We had not yet committed deeply to this work of racial justice. And so in my studies, as my project changed, I started running across certain statistics. As I was trying to figure out how I might lead in that moment, I began to recognize that Black clergy in America have been wrestling with the matter of public policy for years. And people kept telling me as I responded in the uprising that I should look toward the model of the civil rights movement for response. Indeed, in the context of my wrestling, it was during the period of uprising, a year later thereabout, when I met Marian Wright Edelman through Dr. C.T. Vivian and began to engage some of the tools and resources of the Children's Defense Fund to begin to react and to respond to the moment of racial reckoning. But it was in study, it was in the stacks in the library as I began to wrestle with the reality of racial uprisings of the context of America over the years and indeed the globe, that I came to see a couple of things. First, I came to see that maybe I shouldn't look to the civil rights era and or movement for my response. Being a generation or two removed, maybe there was something about the anti-Black sentiment and racial reckoning that happened in South Africa where there were lessons for me. And so that became an element of my study. How might we learn from the schism of racial uprising? How might we learn? What might be the lessons of leadership from the struggle against apartheid in South Africa? That was one. But the other thing that came up for me was as I studied the statistics of the census, I came to know that we were headed toward our own kind of apartheid in America. When I looked at housing policy and discrimination and began to look deeply into education in America and watched the resources and the research of folks who had looked at these matters from a public policy standpoint, I realized that the language of apartheid was not even new. It was not new in America. Those who did housing work understood racialized discrimination. It was not new in America. Those who studied the savage inequalities of public health were already talking about apartheid statistics. What may have been new in the conversation was that as I was studying, I ran across these census statistics that told me that since 2011 in America, the majority of children born were children of color. Since 2014 in America, the majority of children under the age of 5 were children of color. And I learned as I was studying in 2017 that those projections were forecasting that the year 2020 would be the first year in American history when the majority of children under the age of 18 would be children of color. There was a rising, there is a rising, there has been a rising of people of color coming into the majority in America. Yet there has been a decline in representation, especially at the point of my own studies. House, Senate, presidency were held outside of the authority of the communities that were rising. And so what we were headed toward, and indeed some cases we were already in, if you looked at more than 200 counties across America at the time, is that we had situations, or maybe you saw the situation in Ferguson itself, where the majority of population was people of color. People in leadership were not. The definition of apartheid is minority rule. Some may say that the fight over the filibuster right now is for minority rule. That's off manuscript. Let me get back to my topic. And so the conversation is how we might understand together child well-being and racial justice. In that projection, that 2020 would be the year that the majority of children under the age of 18 in America, the 73 million children of America would predominantly be people of color. I understood that to be a forecast. I had no idea that that transition would happen in the moments that we have just experienced, that it would happen in the context of a presidential election of the greatest turnout and consequence perhaps in my lifetime. It would happen in the context of a global pandemic that we had not seen in over a century. It would happen in the context of protests, the racial uprising, not just in response to George Floyd, but Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor over the course of the year. And so what came very clear to me in this moment was the word that I'd once heard from Michael McAfee, the president and CEO of PolicyLink, but made manifest in a new way in this moment. He once said on a panel in Minneapolis that I moderated around racial equity for people in philanthropy, he once said that those who are not engaging in racial equity in the context of philanthropy may just be engaging in work avoidance because this is the work. So I wondered, in the conversations I've been having about early childhood education in St. Louis at the time and quality access to early childhood education, that was a conversation not driven by or responsive immediately to the Black mothers and grandmothers who were gathered around the freedom schools we sponsored in our community, but rather driven by people from the social work schools. We had more than 4 social work schools in our community. If it was the case that these conversations were not being driven by them, was the conversation about early childhood without racial equity, without cultural competence, really work avoidance? Is it the case that when we have conversations about child well-being in America and we do not apply a racial equity lens or do not consider racial justice, we're engaging in work avoidance? Could it adversely be, or inversely be the case that when we have dialogue about racial justice in America and we absent the realities of children and youth, that we're not engaging in sustainability or in sustainable work and conversation, but rather we're making moves that are temporal and temporary for the moment? What I came to finally suggest last year and have been selling it to whomever is buying it is that one cannot do racial equity work in America, racial justice work in America that will be sustainable and that will be consequential without centering children and youth. And one cannot do work for child well-being in America without a commitment to racial justice and expect that you are doing it for all of America's children. These are America's children. They are Black, they are brown, they are indigenous, but they are also the poorest demographic in American history. They are 22% of the population, and they are the most racially diverse generation that we have ever seen. To do work on their behalf is to center and to see race. And to center and to see race is to work on their behalf. So the question may come then, what is the work? The work, it seems to me, must be done at all levels. I am grateful to serve a mission that has grown out not only of the civil rights movement. Children's Defense Fund, founded in 1973, the year that Reverend James Lawson would suggest is the culminating year from 1953 to 1973 of the contemporary civil rights movement, which he calls the nonviolent movement of America. But it is an organization built very specifically out of the Mississippi freedom struggle and freedom summer, where Marion Wright Edelman was the NAACP Legal Defense Fund lead staff, and also very clearly out of the Poor People's Campaign, where she served as the public policy director to Martin King, and as she will tell you, her little apartment in DC was the actual official address for the Poor People's Campaign. And out of that policy agenda, she may also suggest to you that she's been working toward the same aims for the last 40 plus years, working at ending child poverty in America, the ultimate blemish on the idea of the American dream that should be marked by social mobility is the concept of children living in poverty, the idea that we are the last remaining English-speaking developed nation that does not have a permanent child allowance to care for the well-being of children in our homes and our communities, fighting to advance the notion that every child should be nourished and should have access to a quality education, fighting against the notion, even in the most progressive circles, that you can actually help a child without helping their families. The consequential strategic move of the evolution of the Washington Research Project to focus to become the Children's Defense Fund was the reality that people did not care about grown adult poor people in America. but they might listen if you focused on children. And so the Children's Defense Fund policy agenda has been driven by those same principles of the Poor People's Campaign for nearly 50 years. And now we may need to ask the question, because in the context of white supremacy and white nationalism that has been visited even upon the capital of the United States of America, we may well say very clearly, in the interest of the conjoined conversations of child well-being and racial justice, that people don't care about Black and brown people in America. Maybe they will care about children. And so if the demographics are not enough to help us to understand why these two ideas are tied together, then perhaps strategy would suggest that an effective way to have a conversation about racial justice would be to have a conversation about children. What does it mean to care for them and to work on their behalf? For those who are not willing to hear that there is something owed to Black people for the years of slavery and degradation that they have experienced to build a country for free, then perhaps they will hear that the pain and the poverty of Black children is indeed a mark upon the nation that drags down the gross domestic product. When unfortunately people will not hear that the internment, that the attempts at re-education for Indigenous children has robbed generations of wealth and identity. Hopefully they will then hear that there is indeed a security issue with the food insecurity on reservations. Maybe they are not able to hear that Hispanic children and Latinx families living in food insecurity or living near the brink of nourishment is indeed a challenge for those families, for those communities. Perhaps they'll respond to the weak voice of a young person who is crying out at the border to be housed and to be nurtured. These two conversations go together, and quite frankly, the movements of these moments make more possible for all of us. I knew I was going to be in a conversation here today at the public policy school, so I had to back up and be reflective about specific public policies, and so I've been doing this over the course of the last few weeks. We have been happy to celebrate and enter into conversation with media about the advancement of the American Rescue Plan Act. We are glad for the expansion of the child tax credit, responding to this call for a child allowance in America. We are pleased at the increase of 15% and the sustaining of that increase of SNAP benefits, because we recognize that we're not yet out of the pandemic. We are excited about the additional investments in housing stability that are built into the bill, and we recognize that we must work to make these investments permanent, and that means we can't celebrate too long. We've got to get back to work. These policy investments are absolutely critical, and one that has been most critical was left on the floor of rhetoric, and left on the floor of routine, and left on the floor of the regulations of the parliamentarian of the Senate. That a $15 minimum wage, seeking to get closer to a living wage in America, is a critical way to reduce child poverty as well. We are pleased that we were able to cut child poverty in half for Black children, by 61% for Indigenous children, and by 45% for Hispanic children with the expansion of the child tax credit. But we know that this is not permanent, and we do have work to do. We also recognize, someone asked me the other day, do you think anything in this moment is connected to or attributed to the protest movement that we've been in for the last year? I only offered one slight critique. I reminded them we've been in protest mood, and we've been in protest order, and we've been in protest mode for racial justice, and at least for the movement for Black lives, since 2014. And I say to my policy friends, to my policy partners who are responding to the reality of children in America, that powerful movements make progressive policy possible. And so it is critical, and this is part of our future at the Children's Defense Fund, that we invest not only in our policy work in Washington, D.C., or the very solid policy work that is happening at local and county levels around early childhood education all over the country. But it is important that we build movements of leadership development and community organizing to make the environment to protect our policy and make much more progressive policy possible. If we learn nothing on January 6th, we learned that we are no longer engaged in the campaign only of ideas. We're no longer engaged in a debate, even at the space of the Senate. We're no longer engaged only in an exchange over who has the best policy. We're engaged in a struggle over power. And so we who care about children and their families, we who care about racial justice in America, must invest deeply in the work of power building in order to advance policy for our good and for our children. As we engage in that work, that means that there are other domains of influence where we must contest. Yes, we must work toward policy in the public square. I appreciate the work of Manuel Pastor, who suggested there are different arenas for change. Yes, we must work in the legislative arena, and we must consider with welcome this new administrative arena. We must consider the judicial arena, but we must also note that we can make progress on things like the minimum wage and economic inequity in the corporate arena. And this is a space where policy is made as well. So in as much as we take a movement building orientation, we consider the conditions for change, but we also find new arenas for change where we might advance an agenda that is good for the rising majority of children in America, these children of color, in a sustainable way. And finally, I want to argue, before we engage in some question and answer, that if we care about these kinds of policies and we do the work to build toward power building movement, then we have to consider very clearly the future of democracy as well. I know we didn't think that we were going here, but as I hear the conversation today and as I tuned in to the echoes of the presidential press conference, I must wrestle with the reality that voting rights, that I must wrestle with the reality that a minimum wage, I must wrestle with the reality that sustainable policy for children, I must wrestle with the reality that racial justice must pass by the way of the Senate. And it is the case that without the breaking of certain policies that hold back the ability for a majority to rule, we may well be closer to the apartheid status that I studied about in my DMin program. Joe Goldman, the president of the Democracy Fund in 2019, came to St. Louis on our invitation to speak with child advocates in the region about the work we must do to advance well-being for our children. He said in that setting at the Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing, and I quote, "If you want justice, you have to work for democracy." He recognized that voter suppression all over the country put in peril the policies that the majority of Americans, Black, brown, indigenous, poor, single mothers, wanted to get through Congress, wanted to make public policy, was at the whims and the will of an electoral justice system that is being held at bay by those who seek to suppress the vote and never want to see a voter turnout like we saw last year again. They don't want to see one that big. They don't want to see one that brown. They don't want to see an electorate that Black. And so public policy for any progress in America must consider the reality of democracy in America. While we are focusing on policy, while we are building power, we must never forget proximity to those who have need. Every day in America, 2 mothers die from complications of childbirth. 5 children are killed by abuse and neglect. 8 children or teens die by suicide. 9 children or teens are killed by a gun. 20 children or teens die from accidents. 46 children or teens are injured with a gun. 59 babies die before their first birthday. 121 children are arrested for violent crimes. 223 children are arrested for drug crimes. 514 public school students are corporally punished. 678 babies are born without health insurance. 2,906 high school students are dropped by their district. 14,206 public school students are suspended. As they are dropped, they are slipping through our hands. And unfortunately, just like the statistics of child poverty, they are disproportionately Black and disproportionately brown. If you seek to see the America that never was America to me, if you seek to see the fulfillment of that myth of the American dream, if we want to give palpable possibility again to the concept of social mobility, child well-being and racial justice are intimately and forever intertwined. We must work at this intersection to be what we are being called to be. I look forward to discussing this with you, and even more with working to be what our children deserve. Blessings to you. Let's talk.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly profound, and it got my wheels turning, and I'm sure some of the audience members, their wheels turning as well. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Wilson, for your inspiring talk this evening. As Leslie Babinsky mentioned earlier, I'm Carolyn Barnes. I'm an assistant professor here at the Sanford School of Public Policy. And it's my pleasure to lead the Q&A tonight with Clinton Boyd Jr., a postdoctoral associate in the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center. I would like to lead off with a question about something you raised that I don't think I've ever heard put so well before. You said that an effective way to have a conversation about racial justice may mean having a conversation about children. So my question to you is, how do we center a conversation? My dog made a cameo. How do we center a conversation around children of color without pathologizing them and their communities and their families? So you took us through a nice stretch of history about the Children's Defense Fund and its roots in the civil rights movement. And I'm a social policy scholar, and the roots of the early childhood education space in the United States, at least from a federal perspective, comes out of the war on poverty. But some of the ideas about Black families and Black children associated with that war on poverty and with the Johnson administration often pathologizes Black families, Black communities, and Black children, Black and brown children, as deficient, as at risk, as something we need to monitor and rehabilitate. Can you speak to that? How do we create narratives that are more empowering and not pathologizing?
Yeah, I think this is really powerful. And I think it's important, quite frankly, as it relates to all children. We've got to take, I'm very intentional to use the language of flourishing, of thriving, of well-being, because for so long, and I really appreciate the work of Ramesh Raghavan, who's now at the McSilver Institute in NYU on this. Back in 2014, while I was wrestling with these realities out on the ground and in the streets, I was also organizing child advocates in St. Louis with him and really chasing and tracing this matter of our language around child well-being, because much of what we've been doing for children in America, if we follow the heart, has been around child saving. It's about harm mitigation, even the language of child welfare. We're always talking about how to stop things from happening, not about casting a picture of flourishing and thriving. I wrote a piece, finished a piece I've been writing earlier today, trying to help people. We have a crisis of imagination. We actually can't see children thrive. And so we've not built systems for that thriving. And so I just tell people all the time where I go, I say, look, if you want to think child well-being, we don't have good definitions of it. We have some. Ramesh would say we need to think about stage appropriate development. We need to consider the context, that it's contextual and space specific, that there are surroundings and social determining factors that advance child well-being. We need to consider all that when we come to policy, but we need to see first a child smiling, singing, and dancing. Right? The picture of a well child is a child smiling, singing, and dancing. Happy, whole children who are not concerned about what's going on around them sing, smile, and dance. And that's not just Black children, that's all children. Now, having that picture in mind, we must ask ourselves then, what does it take to create the conditions for that to happen with reckless abandon? And then how might we consider asset-based language to advance policy on that behalf? So how do we think about creating context and caring communities rather than stopping harm? How do we talk about economic mobility? Okay, I'll use the language. I'll stop being a preacher and use more appropriate language of the sector, right? How do we speak of economic mobility instead of talking about child poverty, right? I'll get in our own school. We've been working on child poverty for 50 years, and I want to talk about economic mobility, right? I want to talk about living into the concept of the American dream. The American dream, the concept of economic mobility, doing better than your parents if you defer gratification, go to school, and put off having kids until after you get married. Like these three things, right, that we promised for generations broke down for millennials who are more educated than their parents en masse and will not do as well as them by economic projection. So the concept of the American dream has broken down for a generation. Now, if it's gone for millennials, the question is, will it be for Generation Z? If it will be, then we have to go back and imagine what it means to build anew. And quite frankly, I want to argue that we have to dream the whole thing over again. And so we've got to think about what Black joy means. We have to think about Black children engaging and dancing. We have to think about systems for their care. I'll stop with this one because we need proximity to get this done. We work in our freedom schools on culturally competent pedagogy, and we use models in freedom schools that are in many ways a critique to the models of education that are embedded in our schools, especially in urban communities. And so in freedom schools, you don't raise your hand. You don't stand in line unless you desire to. You don't raise your hand because you're important and you have something to say and you have agency. And so because you have something to say, we all need to hear it. But you also don't engage in reading books that don't have your face in them.
Talk about it.
Right? You don't have books that don't show you and your people. And those books that show majority Black and brown faces are not just good for Black and brown children. For the record, they're absolutely good for white children that need to understand that they're growing up in a global society where people of color are the majority. And so it's helpful for all of us if we consider joy, if we consider culturally competent pedagogies as it relates to education, and as we consider asset-based language for all of our children, and consider with a blank slate and a blank page, and you have to do this with Black children first, you have to consider if all the things that have been working in these systems that have been built in America have been harmful to them, why should we try to reform them? Rather, shouldn't we just try to build an alternative from the beginning? And I think that's the kind of imagination we need, but you only get that with a movement building orientation. You don't get that with a policy orientation inside the house and inside these systems. We have to work outside as well. Sorry for being so long.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, I was over here taking feverish notes as you were talking because you definitely offered a lot of quotables. And one of the things that really stood out to me during your talk was this piece around you can't help a child without helping their families, right? And when you think about children, they are nestled within systems, right? And I think we can all agree that the family system is one of the most important systems that a child can be placed in. Some folks would argue that families and parents specifically are children's first teachers, right? And so for me, one of the things that's really resonated with me over the past year, thinking about this pandemic, is the ways in which Black families have been hit exceptionally hard by the dual pandemics, right? Of systemic racism and COVID-19, right? And so I was curious to hear from you, emerging out of the pandemic, how can we best support Black families, understanding that, at least from a parenting standpoint, right, that Black parents tend to have to overcome distinct obstacles to provide for and protect their children.
Yeah. No, I absolutely appreciate that. In this moment, it's going to be really important that we are working to make sure that families and parents specifically in Black communities have access to vaccination. We overcome those barriers by putting it in places that they trust, working with churches. I've read a great article just a few weeks ago that, folks in philanthropy, my colleagues who worked in that field for the last 10 years, need to get over their faith problem in order to solve the COVID problem. You don't do work in Black communities without working with the Black church. It's the only institution that's a full and wholly owned subsidiary of the Black community is the Black church. And so you don't get to the Black family without working with the Black church. So some of it is we've got to get over some of our issues and some of our challenges around religion in order to work directly with Black families to find partners in the context of faith communities. The other, and that includes, of course, providing access to the COVID vaccine. The other is providing robust support. As we talk about infrastructure, I know that's the next dialogue that's coming up as we talk, looking for a place from a policy standpoint to find common ground. We must be considering universal broadband access as an investment in making families that experience what Rebecca Pringle, the president of the NEA, calls the homework gap, even before COVID. And when you don't have access to high-speed internet in your home, you're disproportionately Black and brown, and you end up having a gap in achievement and attainment in school. Then we must consider things like universal broadband access as a part of the policy agenda for infrastructure, as a way to advance racial equity and give parents ways to support their children as they're trying to make up for the learning lost over the course of the last year. And then very specifically, we got to help in working with the schools. One of my best friends in St. Louis is the superintendent of the school district there, and he was losing students, right? The reality of the mobility of students in urban school districts is that they will move 2 or 3 times in a school year, in a basic year. And so social workers have to go and find them in order to support them because something happened at their house, they had to move to a cousin's house, had to move to Big Mama's house. In order to get over those, we need to provide additional investments of support. The American Rescue Plan did some of this to school districts to serve unhoused students. And so providing those wraparound supports to them is also going to be finally critical. The last thing I'll say is that in responding to this learning loss, we're going to need to work double time with our young people without requiring them to work double time because of our deficiencies. What do I mean? I mean things like year-round programming, support for things like Freedom School Partnerships and other after and out of school time supports, youth development supports that meet young people where they are all going to be absolutely critical to making sure that our young people don't fall further behind. And so if we want to support Black young people and support Black families, we have to consider on all levels the infrastructure that they're currently supported in, access to the vaccine, and ability to catch up with double time investment to respond to the COVID learning losses.
Cool. Wonderful. So I think we'll go to the Q&A. We have a few questions here. This is from David DeLucas. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. Reverend Dr. Wilson, at Parents USA, we've coined the phrase parenting while Black because of the evidence that suggests Black parents and parents of color generally are more likely to have encounters with law enforcement and child protective services, even when children are not hurt and not actually at risk of harm. Does the Children's Defense Fund have data to support our views? So this is more of a specific question to you, but could you speak broadly to that phenomenon?
Yeah, glad to speak broadly to the phenomenon, and also glad to have an invitation for a shameless plug. On Monday, we will release the State of America's Children 2021 edition. So if people go to childrensdefense.org, then they'll be able to find that State of America's Children report we put out every year, aggregating data with a special section on child abuse and neglect. And so you might find additional support for that there. And of course, we recognize this matter of disparate contact with police for Black and brown families. We also find disparate contact with the child welfare system for Black and brown children. So these are absolute realities that we need to respond to and to address. And then, of course, we also see that young people are 6 times more likely, Black children are 6 times more likely to be impacted by violence from police themselves. And so I think, I appreciate we can find information on that data and we can quote those statistics all day long. The most significant piece for me is the narrative and the story of separation that happens for the child who has a parent taken away from them by these disparate contacts. And it's not just in these cases with, the child welfare system or child abuse and neglect orders. It's also, local fines and fees that end up extracting wealth from families and pulling, the stacking of fines that has somebody locked up in a medium security jail or workhouse in their local community that also breaks down family or has young people taken away. So it's clearly the case that the carceral system broadly and the carceral nature of our culture has negative impacts on Black and brown children. So this is a matter that if we want to talk about the importance of family connection, right? Early childhood and education, we talk a lot about relational capacity, that bond between a teacher and a student that allows a student to learn. Well, that same bond happens within families. And so when we talk about extracting mama from the house because she didn't make enough money to keep up with the tickets, and so she happened to run into a police officer and got locked up for 6 months, or got locked up because she was poor, not because she was doing anything wrong, right? All of these things have impact for child well-being, right? We tend to talk about them as racial justice issues. Those who are most impacted are the children who are left behind. So I appreciate the work that Parents USA is doing on this matter. Look forward to kind of engaging and partnering based on some of the data that I hope you can find there in the State of America's Children report that will release on Monday. But also say that, this is why child advocates have to be working on these carceral matters, these matters of incarceration and these carceral systems that we call justice systems in America, because they strip children of their parents as well.
Cool. Well, going back to the Q&A, we have another question, and it reads, due to its devastating and wide impact, the pandemic has created a unique opportunity for policy interventions, such as the child tax credits and the American Relief Plan and the additional federal funds flowing down to schools and other needed services and supports. However, many of the current policy expansions will expire within the next year. What is needed to translate these gains into permanent investments in children and youth?
Yeah, I mean, in a word, power. I really appreciate the really important and smart policy work that's been happening, but the fact that I have weekly calls with a woman who's been working toward the same aims for 50 years because one president decided to veto a bill tells me that it's not about the new ideas. There's some valuable ones, right? Socializing universal basic income was something that Martin Luther King was preaching about in the last 2 years of his life when people didn't want to listen to him. The fact that Michael Tubbs, the mayor of Stockton, worked on this project as the youngest mayor of an urban city, by the way, one trained and developed on Alex Haley Farm campus of Children's Defense Fund as a servant leader. The fact that he was working on that matter over the course of the last few years, and we still don't have universal acceptance of the concept, tells us that this is not about policy ideas. This is about who has the power to make stuff happen, right? The reason why the President of the United States of America today refused to weigh in on whether the filibuster should be changed, and rather to a question about whether it should be reformed, he said, and this is a very near quote, "Success in electoral politics is the art of the possible," was because he was afraid of one senator that he couldn't get on board from his own party. He knew he did not have the votes to do the things that he morally wants done. And so this is not a matter of whether we have the right public policies and whether the think tanks have articulated the best ways to get us out of this. By the way, we're not going to policy our way out of we're not going to policy our way out of white supremacy anyway. We're not going to policy our way out of white nationalism anyway. We're not going to policy our way out of institutional racism anyway. But since we know we've got some good policy ideas, the question is, how do we get them through? We get them through by more power. We get them through by leadership development and pipelines of young people who are socialized to the orientation and the ideas that we want implemented on a public space. We get them through by making those young people become elected officials like Michael Tubbs so they can work on universal basic income and getting resources to poor people in a community. We get them through by making sure people know that there are electoral consequences to not doing what Black and brown people sent you there to do. This is how we get the public policy. We make it permanent by making sure that our campaign for the child tax credit did not start on the day that the American Rescue Plan got passed. We filed at the beginning of February. I stood with Congresswoman DeLauro, Congressman Richie Torres, Congresswoman Delbini from Washington to present again the American Family Act with more than 150 co-signers to introduce that into legislation in February before the American Rescue Plan ever came up. So we started the fight for permanence before we got it temporarily. We need everyone to be contacting their senators, particularly their senators. Senators Booker, Brown, and Bennett have been working hard on this. But we also need to say, look, if you need to reform the filibuster in order to make child tax credits permanent, get it done. Then let's reform the filibuster.
Here's another question from the Q&A. One definition of racial equity is a state in which outcomes cannot be predicted by race. So that's the race equity definition. However, systems, education, health, economic development, et cetera, were not built for children of color. How do we tear down these systems and build new ones in the face of white supremacy that fights to keep those systems in place?
Yeah, one of my seminary professors talked about being a pastor in a rural community. He had pastored in Iowa, and his early congregations were these small congregations. And so he would go in and after a while, you're a small church pastor, you gotta learn to be a part of the community no matter what, whether people part of your church or not. And so one of the things that the communities did very often was they had barn raisings. So people came together for church. They came together more often. They all worked together to raise barns from farm to farm. And so he would go into these communities and, young new church pastor, he wants to go and meet the people, he goes to the barn raising. And after he had gone through a few of these, he realized, he wondered, whatever happened to the old barn, right? He never saw anybody tearing barns down, but he knew that he'd never been to a gathering where they did anything with the old barn. So he asked one of the old farmers who's a member of his congregation, and he said, whatever happened with the old barn? He said, we never tear down the old barn. He said, we all come together as a community. We help one another lift new barns to raise the walls of the new barn. We move everything from the old barn into the new barn. And after a while, when we use the new barn, the old barn will fall in on itself from lack of use. So my argument is that part of our work we have to engage in these days is we have to build an alternative witness. We have to build means to take care of our own communities. And so I see this in the movement for Black Lives by my friends and comrades and colleagues. This is a part of the essence and the fingerprint of the Black Panther Party, saying we're not going to depend on people to feed our children. We're going to engage in food programs on our own. We're going to engage in educational programs on our own. My first extended conversation with Mary Wright Edelman when I was wrestling with how to respond to the movement moment in Ferguson, she had a long list of ideas for me. If you ever have a conversation with her, she's gonna have a long list of ideas for you on what you can do to serve and help children. She reminded me that in St. Louis were the Henry Hampton archives at Washington University, there in which you find the Eyes on Applied Prize series. She reminded me, she connected me to a resource, a brother by the name of Dr. Sean Joe, who had just moved to St. Louis, who had been raised by the Black Student Leadership Network of the 1990s that CDF and the Black Community Crusade for Children put together. She told me about freedom schools as a model. She knew exactly how many freedom schools there at one time had been in St. Louis, up to 19, even though we were down to 1. And when she pointed to all of those resources, she told me you could take the Henry Hampton Archives and you could set up Saturday schools in all of the churches using that curriculum. And Sean Joe, who's now at Washington University, can help you with that. And you can work with us to sponsor freedom schools, not just as alternatives, but guess what? When we started doing a network of freedom schools, we worked and partnered with 3 school districts, and the kids who came to our freedom schools had better learning and growth taught by college students in our freedom schools than the kids who went to summer school, beat them by months in their growth and development. So not only did our alternative witness that we built, the new barn we built beside the system, did better than the system, but then the system started to ask the question, hey, can we just take these freedom schools and make summer schools into freedom schools? So I think we reform the systems by showing the systems a better way, but we have to build outside of them with our own resources. If we know they've never been built for us, then I think we should stop wrestling with trying to take them and turn them into something that's for us. We should build an alternative and make that old barn fall in on itself and make them move the resources into the barn that we built. It's the time for us to build.
Got you. Well, do we have time for one more question? I'm gonna go for it. As it relates to happy whole children, not decoupling care for any domain of early childhood development, how do you suggest reimagining the notion of quality as it relates to our early childhood development systems?
Yeah, no, I really do affirm a lot of the conversations that are happening related to quality right now. I think states should have quality standards at the state level. I also think, and I think that has to do with education. I think it's absolutely deplorable that there are such low standards for the people that have to take care of my kids. I have a 5-year-old. All of my kids have done early child education at some level. I think it's been absolutely inappropriate. Some of the settings that my wife and I have visited where people actually leave their kids. I refuse to leave my kids in a lot of these places. So I think we have to affirm, yes, we have to affirm standards around education. We have to provide supports, and we have to consider creating an actual system. Let's be clear, we've not created a system for early childhood education. And we have to take a hard look at the fragmented network of independent service providers, even the 501c3 providers. Because part of what we're trying to do by looking at quality standards, quite frankly, is we're trying to force a systemic approach onto a fragmented reality. And so the under-resourced, underfunded network of independent providers, for-profit and nonprofit, may not get us there at all. And so we do need to take more seriously the idea of K-12s, school districts actually dropping down to 3 years old. Right. That's going to have implications for the business models, quite frankly, of these independent service providers. But as K-12 systems drop down, we actually can put quality standards on them because we're already holding them to quality standards for K-12. But we must also finally consider that equity must be part of the conversation. Cultural competency and quality have to go together when we're talking about an early childhood system that serves the majority children of color, and that has not been the critical conversation. It has not been centralized in the conversation about quality in American early childhood yet, but it must be centered because that's what we're serving.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Absolutely glad to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity. I know we're running up against time. This is what happens when you invite a Black preacher in a time.
Ain't nothing wrong with it.
I'm always ready to go to church.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Wilson. And thank you, Carolyn and Clinton. What an inspirational discussion. And thank you all for the work that you do. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors and to thank all of our participants for joining us today. We'd like you, as your next step, participants, to click on the survey in the chat to tell us what you stand for. Join Sanford's Stand For Challenge and share any feedback that you have for us today about the event. We also hope to see you on April 15th for the final Stand For Spring event. It's called Stand For Equality, a live podcast as part of the Ways and Means session of the Arc of Justice from Here to Equality. The link is in the chat as well. Thank you from all of us in the Center for Child and Family Policy and the Sanford School of Public Policy. Good night, everyone, and thank you for joining us.